So my name is Dr. Colleen Dean. I'm currently an MRC Fellow at the University of Exeter, and I'm very much interested in understanding muscles and how you lose your muscles, and that can be in response to ageing, but also particularly spaceflight. So currently we're here in the labs where we actually perform some of our worm experiments and where we did all the setup before we actually sent our worms to the International Space Station.
Why has the UK sent worms up to space?
So I think the key thing is spaceflight is associated with many negative health consequences, and one of the particular ones is a loss of muscle mass when you're in space. So we know that astronauts can go to the International Space Station, they spend 6 months to a year up there, and they might engage in a resistance exercise training program and aerobic exercise training programs, but they still lose their muscles, and we still don't know why. And that's really a major health concern for astronauts, because this loss of muscle, that can really impact their in-space flight abilities, and also once they come back down to Earth, in emergency situations, it might actually impair their performance in that too. So we need to try and understand why muscle is wasting in space flight and how we can overcome it. So what we've done is we've led two experiments. The first one was the molecular muscle experiment, and that was the first UK-led experiment to the International Space Station, and we did that in 2018. But then we've also done the molecular muscle experiment too, and we did that last year, and that was a follow-on from our molecular muscle experiment. And what we do is for these, we send tiny microscopic worms to space. So these tiny worms, although they look very different to us and you need a microscope to see them, they are actually very, very similar to humans and the way that our muscles work. So actually the genes that worms have, so the molecules that they have that are their instructions for building, they have 80% of those that are similar to us. So they're a very good model for us to use as humans. And the reason that we send them to space, in addition to being a good model for humans, is that they're tiny, so we can send up thousands to space. So our experiments, we typically send up 36,000 worms at a time. With both of our experiments, we've sent 36,000, so say you're looking at 70,000 odd already, and there has been quite a few worm experiments in the past as well. So my rough guess is 500,000, but that might be nowhere near true.
What happens once they get to the International Space Station?
So what they do is, as soon as the capsule docks with the International Space Station and the astronaut takes the worms out, they will essentially transfer the experimental cassettes which have the worms into a cubic incubator. And what that does is that it keeps our worms at 20 degrees. So actually the astronauts don't have to do much in terms of interaction. They don't have to play with them or anything like that. They simply just put them in the incubator for that 5 to 6 day period. And then when that's over, what they then do is transfer the experimental cassettes into a freezer, which is called Melfi, so where they then remain until they come back down to Earth.
What happens to the human body in space?
So, I mean, from a muscle perspective, we do know that when astronauts go to space, they do lose muscle. And when they come back from space, what that means is they have to engage in some quite intensive exercise programs to try and get this muscle back. So to try and counter this, currently astronauts do exercise in space. So for example, Tim Peake did run a marathon while he was up on the International Space Station. And there is also a device up there that astronauts can use to actually do resistance exercise, so where they're lifting against a weight. But although they engage in these programs, they still actually do lose their muscle. So what we need to do is understand why and how we can overcome that. Some of the molecules that are involved in metabolism, so energy usage, and also some of the molecules involved in transducing the exercise signals or the movement signals, these are reduced in spaceflight, and we think these are key to trying to understand how we can overcome that. So those are two of the mechanisms and two of the hypotheses that we're probing with our spaceflight missions.
What is the link between space and aging?
We know that as you get older, your muscles decline, similarly to as they do on spaceflight. And we've actually seen that in older people, again, the molecules that are regulating some of the energy signals that we're using and some of the exercise signals, so the signal transduction pathways, they're also changed in aging as they are in spaceflight. So if we can use spaceflight as this accelerated model of aging, and if we can understand the mechanisms better and find ways to overcome it, then hopefully that might be able to be used to treat muscle loss with aging as well on Earth.
Why is this dangerous for astronauts?
I think with astronauts losing muscle, one of the most key concerns around that is that when they do come back to Earth and they have that gravitational pull, if they were to land in the Atlantic and get stuck in an emergency situation in a crew capsule, it really could, or the lack of muscles and the deconditioning really could impact their ability to perform in that emergency situation. So, and luckily to my knowledge it hasn't happened yet, but of course we don't ever want those types of things to happen. So that's why we really need to try and look after their muscles while they're in space and when they come back.
What have you learnt so far?
So we have had some of our collaborator findings already published. So we do know, for example, that the neuronal morphology, so the way that these neurons look, does change in spaceflight. And we also know that the contact of the worms when they're in spaceflight, or the loss of contact due to loss of gravity, also affects the health of these worms. But we're also still working our way through our analysis. So what we're going to do with the worms that have been returned from these missions is actually look at all of the genes, so all of the molecules within these worms, and see how they've changed due to spaceflight. So watch this space, because we're still going through these findings and looking forward to seeing what the outcomes are. What we're looking to do is when we get those results and find out what genes are changing, that will be the first thing that we look at. So for example, the energy producing proteins, say they're reduced. What we might also be able to do is that we're then actually using therapeutics to try and target those. So we're currently testing, for example, therapies to try and improve the mitochondria, so the energy producing parts of the muscle. So if we find that works, what we would then do is obviously want to test it a bit further beyond worms, and if that's really impactful, and then that's when we could start looking at how we can apply it to aging and older adults.
How could this help people live longer?
Yeah, I mean, it could be gene therapy, but it could also be something as simple as a nutritional supplement that we would also combine with something like a training program, because we know that resistance exercise training, for example, is very good at trying to offset some of the muscle loss that we see with aging, for example. So it might be that if we find a very good nutritional supplement or drug, we could combine that and see if we can fully counteract this muscle loss. But things like testosterone, the hormone, is very good at really bolstering muscle mass. You could also, there's some clinical trials happening at the moment in terms of things like rapamycin, which also might be good for preventing muscle loss. So there's some of the few, but others, have started looking at trials in terms of vitamin D, also NAD precursors or vitamin B, to see the effects of vitamin B, because we know that as we get older, within our mitochondria, so within that energy producing part of the cell, there's a nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, so something that helps generate ATP, the energy, is reduced in aging. So there's all sorts of things that we think might be helpful.
Could this also help humans colonize space?
What would be key is trying to understand a bit more about the biological impacts of being on the moon, especially for more prolonged periods of time. So I think, to be able to even in the first instances send, worms to the moon to see what happens to their muscles there, and then have a look at those findings, that might give us a real good insight into then how we might be able to manage astronauts on the moon for, say, prolonged periods of time, or even to Mars, to really just first understand the biological impacts of these altered gravity places. There's always an aspiration to send our model systems to these types of places, just to understand the differences of different atmospheres and different gravity levels on the muscles. So I think, yeah, for sure, by going to sending the worms to the moon, it will definitely impact our way forward in terms of Mars, because it could even be in terms of logistics, how to get them there safely and how long they can survive for and things like that.
What is the next step?
I think for this project immediately, we still have some of our samples which we're currently analysing. So that's really exciting to see, what we get, and that will help us, understand a bit more about muscle loss, what therapies might help, and will probably obviously lead to more questions than answers, most likely. And I think for me, the key thing would be obviously completely continuing to drive it forward. So, we do know that people want to go to Mars, we do know that people want to go to the moon. So if we can ultimately see some of our experiments on these platforms, I think that's really exciting for me.